Well, I think it's a real gift to be here in general, and I think it's a gift for me to be up here to teach. I think that in ways we're all teachers and we're all learners. We all learn from each other and get to teach each other. And it's a really cool thing. And my prayer for us today is that we all get a chance to be taught from God in this moment, and that somehow we walk away from here changed. And I want that for myself too. So I know we prayed a lot, but I want to pray one more time before I get into it. So Father, thank you that you are here. Thank you that you're faithful. Father, as we're all here in this moment, speak to us in whatever way that you want to speak to us. It'll probably look different for everyone. But as I'm even speaking, teach me in this moment, show me how I'm changing to be more like you in this moment. And use your word to powerfully affect us and allow us to be more like you. We love you. Amen. Am I too loud? Is it good? Okay, cool. Sweet. So we're in this series. Where is it? That's going to show up soon. We're in a series. There it is. It's a long story. Redeeming broken stories. Someone designed that. It's cool. So today we're going to talk about Ruth. So this is the third sermon of the series, and Ruth is great because it's a whole book. So that's awesome, and it's an interesting opportunity because 4 chapters is a lot to read. So if we were to read the whole story, it would take 16 minutes. So decided to not do that, but I'm gonna kind of lay it out for you. So the first part is just I'm gonna build some context, kind of tell about the story of Ruth, whether you're familiar with it or not, and then I'll kind of just share what my experience was reading it, and then we'll be done. So really quick. Okay, so Ruth is one of the few short stories of the Old Testament. It's a power-packed story that summarizes a bunch of themes that would have been really relevant to a Jewish reader during the times of the First Covenant. It takes place during the time of the book of Judges, which was a very dark time for Israel, just full of apostasy, corruption, and injustice. And it's a beautiful narrative piece that would have provided an answer to the question for a Jew at the time of where is God amidst the suffering and hardship of his people. And we're going to get into it now. So here's a little overview. This is the first 5 verses in the book. So in the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. So a man from Bethlehem in Judah, together with his wife and 2 sons, went to live for a while in the country of Moab. The man's name was Elimelech, his wife's name was Naomi, and the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites in Bethlehem, should have practiced that word, from Bethlehem, Judah, and they went to Moab and lived there. Now Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. They married Moabite women, one named Orpah and the other Ruth. After they had lived there about 10 years, both Mahlon and Chilion also died, and Naomi was left without her 2 sons and her husband. So a little overview of the rest of the chapter. Naomi begins the journey back home towards Judah, and towards the end of the journey, or about when they get there, she says to her daughters, Ruth and Orpah, there's nothing for you here. There's not going to be a future for you. Just go back to Moab, try to build a life for yourself. Just leave me alone, pretty much. And she persisted and persisted. Eventually, Orpah decided she would go back. She returned home. But Ruth was not going to budge. She said in verses 16 and 17, Ruth said, "Don't urge me to leave you or to turn back from you. Where you go, I will go. And where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried." May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if even death separates you and me. So, Ruth and Naomi go to Bethlehem. Chapter 2. Naomi and Ruth are discussing where they will get food. And it just so happens to be the beginning of the barley harvest. So Ruth goes out to look for food, and it just so happens that she ends up picking grain in the field of a guy named Boaz, who just so happens to be their family redeemer. And in Jewish, or the old cultural context, if a man dies and is left behind a wife or child or land, it was the family redeemer's responsibility to marry that widow, take up that land and protect that family. So that's who Boaz was. And over some time, this is chapter 3, Naomi and Ruth begin to chat about how Ruth can begin to let Boaz know she's available for marriage. So Naomi hatches a plan. Ruth stops wearing clothes of a grieving widow, and at night she heads down to the place where Boaz will rest after a hard day's work. As she kind of approaches where he's resting, he wakes up and he's like, "What are you doing?" And she's like, "Hey, like, do you remember me?" Right? And she pretty much made her intentions really clear. She said, like, "Will you be the one to redeem Naomi's family? And also, hey, will you marry me?" And he's like, "Actually, yeah, I'd love to. But let's do that, let's make it official tomorrow in front of all the town elders and whatever." So the next day, chapter 4, at the last second, though, Boaz realizes that there's actually another dude who's closer to be like the family redeemer than he is. It's a disaster. But turns out, that guy was he wanted the land, he wanted to inherit the land, but when he found out he also had to marry the Moabite Ruth, he was like, "Yeah, actually, I'm okay, I'll do without it." So Boaz, though, knowing Ruth's character, knowing her just goodness in her heart, he married her, so he redeemed Naomi's family and married Ruth. So to the conclusion of the overall story, it ends with a reversal of the tragedy in the first chapter. So the death of the husband and sons is reversed as Ruth and Boaz have a new son who brings joy to Naomi. And the opening tragedy is followed by a great act of loyalty by Ruth. This is matched at the end of the story by a great act of loyalty from Boaz towards Ruth that leads to the family's restoration. And the symmetry of the outer chapters highlight the design of the inner chapters as well. So both chapter 2 and 3 begin with Naomi and Ruth kind of deciding what they're going to do in that day, in that moment. And then it's followed by a providential meeting, and then the chapters conclude with Naomi and Ruth rejoicing at what's taking place. So that's Ruth. Ruth is a beautifully written story. I loved reading it. I read it 5 or 6 times before I wrote down anything. I just wanted to read it because it's a narrative piece, it's a story. So you just get to read it as a story. And I really recommend sometime for you, just whether you like coffee or tea. I know some of you don't like coffee. Just grab a cup or something and read it and just ask God, what do you want to highlight to me through this story? For me, after reading it multiple times and asking him that question, what stood out to me is that this moment matters. This moment matters. And with that idea comes a few thoughts. And before I share those, I want to ask a few questions. Okay? So what are you longing for? What are you longing for? I'm going to take a drink of water. What past hurt, injustice, or defeat has been latching on to you? And what qualities have you been stepping into so far this year? Just a few questions to think about. So this moment matters. And a few things go along with that. The first is that your past doesn't define you. It can change you. It can mold you. It can in a way, start things to how you become how you are, but it doesn't define you. The beginning of Ruth is extremely tragic. I probably didn't read it in a super tragic way, but it is a tragic beginning of a story. The setting itself is tragic. The Israelite nation was in this time of just continually rejecting God. There was violence, there was corruption, there was just a big mess. It was super ugly. That's like the time frame alone, not even like looking specifically at the story of Ruth. But the story starts out with famine, so there was lack, and then there was moving away from the land of God to a land of the Moabites, right? And then Naomi's husband dies. Then the sons marry non-Yahweh followers, like following women. And then they die, the husbands die, so Ruth's husband dies, and Naomi's sons die. And I can't, that alone could be a whole message. You know what I mean? Because I can't imagine. I can't imagine the loss, the pain. And with that, bears down on Naomi, bears down on Ruth and Orpah, a very grim look into the future. It was probably so bleak. That's how it just starts off. And none of those circumstances, none of those things are good. None of them are good. They are all a result of a world that's been bent in the wrong direction, away from God, away from His design. It's been this ripple effect of sin from day one. That's where those things came from, and none of them are good. But notice how Ruth and Naomi engage with their circumstances. So Naomi suffered incredibly lost, and she's extremely overcome just by grief, and Naomi chooses to let that become her story. This is made evident when she asks her daughters to leave her, and then after, when she literally renames herself Mara, bitter. That means bitter. She's like, God's dealt bitterly with me. I'm going to just live in this place and just let it be my whole identity. She literally made it her identity. On the other hand, Ruth, who also suffered from the loss of her husband, she does reconcile with her grief, and she stays with her grieving mother-in-law, but she doesn't stop there. Ruth demonstrates a willingness to move into the next chapter when she says, "Your people will be my people. Your God, my God." She came to a point where she realized where she was at, and then she chose for herself a different and alternative future. So their circumstances, although very painful, their circumstances provided an opportunity to step into something different. It was an opportunity to step into change. Pete Scazzaro says it well when he shares in his book, pain has an amazing ability to open us to new truth and to get us moving. It shows us that huge areas of life remain untouched by Jesus. So both Naomi and Ruth hit a wall. And we hit walls a lot. I think COVID was a wall for all of us. And what's hard about a wall is that it's usually pretty painful, and it causes you to have maybe a lot of doubt and a lot of just wonder, and it shakes you to your core. But the good thing about a wall is that if you've been really caught up with something in your past, a wall will bring you to the future, because it hurts so much that you're confronted with the pain that you're feeling right now in this moment, and it brings you back to right here and right now, and then you're faced with a choice of what you're going to do next. That's what's good about the wall, and that's what happened to them. So they both had the choice of how they were going to respond to being, okay, this is where I'm at, this is what I'm feeling, what now? And the hitting the wall leads us back to the present. This is what I'm trying to say, I think. And I guess this is the next part. Your present is where you can actively decide your future. So the story of Ruth shows how God works behind the scenes to weave together our mundane, everyday choices and events into a beautiful story. Because we live in this tension of like all these choices that we make every day, no matter how big or how small, and then God's like massive will and like plan for our lives. And like sometimes it's really hard to know like when I should step forward and when I should just wait for Him to like do things for me, right? So like that's like what this whole book is kind of showcasing, which is super awesome. And sometimes, like for me, it's really easy to begin living in the future because of something I'm excited about. And perhaps sometimes it's easy, or if you have a very difficult past, if you have something in your past that's torn you apart, or ripped at you, or just been tragic, it's easy to look to the future as an escape from the way you're feeling right now. But what if our future is actually dependent on how actively engaged we are in this present moment? Every providential meeting in Ruth first begins with a really simple and tangible step into reality. Something that I think is really, really interesting thing about Ruth too is like she is really known by, I feel like, us as just being like almost perfect. Like she's known just by all her really good qualities, but she's not known for like being like a Moabite necessarily who married into a Jewish family, which at that time would be like not great. And she's really not known for, it seems like not really much else except just her amazing qualities. Especially loyalty and courage. And that just leads me to like wonder or ask myself like what qualities will I be remembered for? And what qualities will you be remembered for? This is falling. That'd be bad. And I'm just gonna like highlight a few things that stood out to me in terms of her qualities. The first being that she was present with Naomi, and she was able to love her by staying with her no matter her emotional state. You know, there's like some people that are like super fun to be around and like you just want to be around them all the time and they're awesome. How do I type this? There it is. And then there are people who have been through a lot. And they carry with them a lot of pain. And they're a little bit harder to be around. It takes more energy. It takes more of yourself. Naomi probably wasn't the most fun person to be with. I mean, if you go as far to rename yourself bitter, I'm guessing you probably act on that a good amount. She was in a tremendous state of grief and despair. But Ruth chose to love on her and cared for her no matter how much it possibly slowed down her life. And what I mean by slowed down her life is like, Naomi literally didn't think Ruth had a future if she followed her. Like her only chance was for marriage, for any sort of like provisional like well-being beyond just making it was back in Moab. But Ruth, for whatever reason, just chose to be with Naomi, no matter how much it slowed down her opportunity. And for myself, I just wonder, like, where else in life am I not slowing down? And where can I slow down? Like, where can I slow down my finances, or the way that I look or appear, or even just my time, my status to love people where they're at? Another quality about Ruth, I think, was that she was super diligent and purposeful just in the little things, like going out and gathering grain for her and her mother-in-law. And something that's cool about this is that God opened the door for that to happen. In Deuteronomy 24:19, he says, "When you are harvesting in your field and you overlook a sheaf, do not go back to get it. Leave it for the foreigner, the fatherless, and the widow, so that the Lord your God may bless you in all the work of your hands." So God created a system for farmers to actually leave behind certain grain for people like Ruth to go pick up. But that doesn't negate the fact that Ruth still actually went out into the field and did it. And then I also think about how the way she did it mattered. Because Boaz noticed Ruth because of the way that she was out there day in and day out gathering grain. So what would have happened if she was like grudgingly gathering grain, or like not gathering it to the best of her ability, or just like complaining about it the whole time? Like, would have Boaz even still noticed her in the first place? And my mother-in-law always says this like thing, right? She says the way you do one thing is the way you do everything. And I think about that a lot. But like, if Ruth would have shown up, if the qualities she stepped into, even doing something simple, ordinary, everyday, like gathering grain, if she would have showed up doing it like half-heartedly, how would that have affected the rest of her story? And for us, like going to work, doing the simple things, like around the house or helping out friends or whatever it is, like how does the way we show up doing those things affect the overall story of us and the people around us? Just something to think about. I'm thinking about it. And then one more thing for Ruth about her qualities. And that was that she was courageous enough to step into the mystery. Sometimes we're confronted with an opportunity we feel is right, but the door isn't open yet. And for Ruth, in my mind, it's just like her actually going to Boaz when he's like asleep, which is just weird. But she goes to him, and she's going to ask him to be their redeemer. And she's going to ask him pretty much to marry her. And like, that's not, they didn't have from what we know, they didn't have a ton of chemistry. Like, there's a little bit there, but they don't have, like, we don't know how long they dated or anything. And she's like honestly willing to look pretty stupid. And she's willing to like maybe hear a no in order to hear a yes. And like, I don't know, like that's just, for me in my life, that's like a scary thing. Is when like I feel like something's right, but I don't know how it's gonna play out, and I might look really dumb, and I might fail, I might fall on my face. So like how do I go about that? Like, how do we confidently move in the present when we can't see the future? And, like, is it worth it? So, like, how do I risk failing? Hearing the no, how is it worth it? And actually, I'm going to ask the worship team to come up, if that's cool this time. And for me, it's worth it because I know my future. In a way, like I know my future in a way. I know that my future is wrapped within a promise. The book of Ruth invites us to consider how God might be at work in the very ordinary, mundane details of your life. God's providence is at work behind every scene of this story. Like Naomi believed that her tragedy was something that she did, or like her fault, or God punishing her, but really the whole story is about God's mission to restore her and her family. And he does so through Ruth and Boaz. And when I mean like your future is wrapped within a promise, the promise isn't going to make sense unless you know the God and the Father and just Jesus, the one who's giving you the promise. And I think knowing his character is everything. So knowing that, like when he says in Exodus 34:6 that he's compassionate and gracious, actually believing that. And when he says that he is a father with good intentions towards us, that we actually believe that, even when we don't always see it. And that when he says he'll walk with us, even through the valleys, the shadows, death, that he's with us, that he's a friend who walks with us. When we believe that, it makes it all the easier. And we have a Holy Spirit who isn't content to just leave us in a place of brokenness, but he's faithful to finish what he started. And Paul uses this language in Philippians 1:6, being confident of this, that he who has begun a good work in you will carry it on to completion until the day of Jesus Christ. If it's not beautiful, then God's not finished. If it's not beautiful, then he's not finished. And that might look different for everyone here. It might look different because we're still on this side of eternity. But there's one thing that I know for sure that I can be confident in, is that is if you put your faith in the man, in Jesus, then this side of eternity doesn't matter as much. God will finish what He started in you, and you get to be a part of it. Our job isn't to passively wait for God to change everything. It's to move in faith at the pace of Jesus, knowing God is at work, even when we don't always see it right away. I love the way the book of Ruth concludes, because it's like the most mind-blowing. Like, you think it's already a good story, and then you actually read the end, and then you're like, oh shoot, like it just started, right? The book of Ruth concludes with a genealogy, which sounds really lame, but it shows that Boaz and Ruth's son Obed was the grandfather of King David. And from King David came the Messiah, Jesus of Nazareth. So the story about redemption is like the story of like the beginning of the final redemption. And it's like this crazy inception thing that God does, and He's super cool. But the last thing I just want to leave you with is that you only get one story. We have this one opportunity. Every moment is an opportunity, but it's one story collectively that you get to write with God. And how do you want that to go? What qualities do you want to step into today? And if you don't know Jesus, like if you don't know what it means to put your faith and trust in Him, and like you don't know how it is to walk with Him, I encourage you to like find me or Pastor Abby or Natalie or anyone up here, most likely anyone around you, and just like ask about Jesus, because He's everything. So yeah, we're gonna go into this last time of worship. And Father, just thank you so much for this time. Thank you for Ruth. Thank you for Boaz. Thank you for Naomi. Thank you for each of their stories that you played a master role in. Thank you that you let us have a story with you, and that we actually do get to move in it and like almost create our own plot. But that at the end of the day, you have our best interests in mind, and your idea for our story is always better than ours. So help us to trust you with your version of the story. We love you.